Tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to today's Kōrero for Mental Health Awareness Week. I'm Gina. I'm the Head of Delivery at Ignite Aotearoa, and it's great to have you join us for today's Kōrero as we are supporting and acknowledging Mental Health Awareness Week. And the theme for this year's Mental Health Awareness Week of Take Time to Kōrero, a little chat could go a long way. Today, I'm joined by Richard Moore, who is a financial mentor in our Ignite platform. And it's great to have Richard along. I'm sure he's going to share some great insights with us. Before we get into our chat, I'll invite Richard to introduce himself.
Thanks very much, Gina, and thanks everybody for coming along for a little chat today. Yeah, as Gina said, I'm Richard. Very nice to meet you all, albeit virtually. I'm originally from the UK, as you can probably tell by the accent, but I've been here in New Zealand for almost 10 years now with my now wife and our two lovely children who are keeping us very busy through lockdown. So I hope you're all well. And get a little bit of something out of today's Kōrero. I will just take this opportunity just to say that the topics that we'll cover today should not be considered financial advice. While I'm a financial mentor, I am not an authorized financial advisor. So the topics that we'll cover will just be general concepts around finances and behaviors, etc., etc. If you do want some, individualized financial advice, there's places you can go to find an authorized financial advisor, such as the FMA's website, etc.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. What I'm really interested, I know when we first met, we had a really great conversation about how you got interested in financial well-being and mentoring other people around financial matters. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, sure. It's been an interesting journey for me, and I guess I've always been a little bit interested in sort of finances and money. I had like a little piggy bank when I was a kid, and it's always been something that I've been sort of a little bit interested in, but never really paid a lot of attention to. And I'm probably quite typical of a lot of people. I grew up in a house where money was a bit of a taboo subject. I'm from a very working class background. My dad was a coal miner in the UK. My mum didn't work. And so we were brought up with, this view that you kind of don't really talk about money. So never really learned anything about money or financial products or how they work or anything. So I'd sort of just bumbled my way along, and I went to university eventually, and I got all this money thrown at me through student loans and a grant. There was if anybody still remembers those, as they were at the time, and overdrafts and credit cards and things like that. So I got myself into a large amount of trouble through not really knowing a great deal about it. And what I found in dealing with that was that it was a huge mental load, worrying about who is going to be calling me on the phone, who's going to be knocking on the door. And I didn't even realize what that mental load really looked like until I'd gotten on top of it. And actually the point where I posted, as we did back then, my check off to pay off my last bill, my last debt. And I just felt this massive weight just lift off my shoulders. And that was a real realization for me that how this sort of stuff can affect our mental well-being without us really knowing and acknowledging it too well.
That's really interesting, Richard. And I think I would say I probably have some similar experience in terms of not really talking about finances or financial well-being wasn't really a thing growing up. And I'm interested in, why is it, do you think, that people are hesitant to talk about money and finances? Why is it maybe a bit of a taboo subject, even within families?
Yeah, I think it's a few things, to be honest. And there may be more, there may be less, but I think generally what I've found when I've talked to my friends or families or people that I try and help through sort of initiatives such as this, is that a lot of it comes from people coming from a place of fear or even embarrassment that they don't know. And I think that comes from, us not having a financial education system in schools, which I'm sure we'll get onto later. But I think what really happens is that you don't get taught about this stuff in school. You don't get taught this stuff when you go through, an apprenticeship to go into a trade, or through university if you go on to a professional qualification, or through any other thing. And then you sort of arrive in your early to mid 20s, and at some point along the way, you're just supposed to have acquired this knowledge. And it becomes a little bit embarrassing if, to sort of put yourself out there and say, well, actually, I don't know what the difference between a loan and an overdraft is. And so I think that is one thing. I think we were always taught generationally that it's rude to talk about money as well. I think some of it can come from a sort of tall poppy syndrome. I mean, certainly when I was a kid, growing up in my family background, there was this view that most people with wealth had either cheated their way to get it, kind of trodden over the backs of other people to get it, or been lucky enough to inherit it. So, it had quite negative connotations, and I think it does have quite negative connotations for a lot of people. And also, these messages are sort of reinforced. We're not encouraged to talk about our salaries, for example. Employers like us to keep our salary and remuneration details quite personal. We're not really taught to be open about our debts and our struggles and our plans on the other side as well. We talk quite vaguely about our plans for the future, but we don't really have active conversations about financial well-being with each other.
Thanks, Richard. There's some really you make some really good points there, and I'm interested in the concept of financial well-being, and you touched on that a little bit in your introduction, where you talked about the sort of link with your financial difficulties in your younger years with your mental health. And I'm just, why do you think it's important? Like, what do you see as that link between financial well-being and our overall well-being?
Yeah, well, I mean, finances and money management they're such a huge part of our life and such a huge part of our goals and our futures. So, most people's goals around finances come to things like, I want to buy a house at some point, I want to retire comfortably, I want to help my children, and make sure my loved ones are taken care of when I shuffle on. And we pretty much interact with money on a daily basis. And if we're not good at doing that, if we have poor financial behaviors, if we're scared of it, if we don't understand it, and we take a bit of a head in the sand approach to it, that's when it can start to get out of control. I'm a real big fan of using like relatable stories to tell things. So one of the things that I will often talk to people about is that financial products that are out there from banks, and when we go to buy something in a store and use a store card, or we go to get finance for a new car or something like that, all of these things are like financial tools that can help. Like any tool, they can help us do a job faster and more effectively. But like any tool that we choose to use, if we misuse them or we don't know how to use them properly, there's a very real danger that we can hurt ourselves. But in this case, obviously, we're hurting ourselves mentally if we're misusing financial tools, because we're creating an environment where we end up worrying about our finances, and expending a lot of mental time and energy, pouring into that worry.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think at Ignite, we take a whole of life approach to wellbeing, and financial is one of those areas where I think, like you've described, we really acknowledge that is an integral part of our overall wellbeing. You started then to talk about some of the things that we might encounter along the way or throughout life. And I wanted to ask you if you could identify what might be the top 3 areas that you think people would benefit from some more knowledge or support around. Some of the I'm not sure whether that would include some of the things you started to mention around like car loans, etc. But would there be some top areas that you think people would benefit from knowing more about?
Yeah, I think the conversations that I tend to have with people, quite often they'll start with how do I get more money, and that's often what we think is a solution to us needing, our financial situations is just, oh, if I have more, then it will be fine. But it really does come down to how to address behaviors, and I think that's one thing that I think people need some help with is what are my money behaviors, and how do I plan, and how do I prioritize what activities I need to undertake when it comes to my spending. So there's this quite amusing expression that if you can't manage $100, you can't manage $1 million. If you've got bad habits, you've got bad habits, and it doesn't matter how much money you throw at that bad habit. If you don't address the habit itself, it doesn't matter how much money you've got, you're never going to fix it. So I think that's one area that often gets sort of neglected is what people's actual habits are when they come to money. I think that, to take it back a step, I think that this all starts with, a basic financial education, and really some basics that we just don't have the opportunity to learn. I mean, there are some programs in schools here now, which is fantastic to see, the likes of Banker and things like that getting into schools, but it really does start with that education, basic financial management, what financial products are. I mean, again, probably relatable example, but when I went to school, I learned a whole bunch of things that I've never used. So, for example, I can tell you exactly how an oxbow lake forms. I can tell you exactly, what the cross section of a volcano looks like. I probably can't remember any Pythagoras these days, but I never got taught what taxes are, or how to pay bills, or anything like that. So. Yeah, I think a basic level of financial education is something that people would really benefit from. And also with the financial services industry as well, I'd really like to see better and cheaper access to financial professionals. For most people, this looks like going into the bank and asking for some help. But there's a whole plethora of sort of financial professionals out there, the qualified financial advisors I mentioned in my disclaimer, etc. But they are fee-based, and those fees can be quite high for some of them. So I'd like to see that stuff come down in price a lot, and people be able to genuinely get a lot of help. There's a lot of free resources out there as well, but I'd just like the availability to be a lot more widespread.
Some great ideas there, Richard. What are some things that those of us that are on the call today, if we're sitting here thinking, oh yes, this is an area that I really need to do something about, what would be your advice for where to start? There's a bunch of things really, and again, a lot of the sort of conversations I start with people have sort of vague ideas of what they want to do, and they know that they might need to get a little bit better at a few things, but not sure where to start. So this is a really great question. One of the best things that you can do to get started is really take some time to understand what money you have coming in and where that money is going. Our pockets can be quite leaky without us realizing it. And even though we think we might have a good understanding of where our money is going, often it's kind of disappearing without us understanding why and where and how. So, for example, I'll tell you a story about myself. A few years ago when I was working, I got into this habit of, on my way into work, I would buy a coffee from Mojo. And I'd still buy several coffees throughout the day. But that one coffee in the morning, I was in a really boring meeting one day, and I just started to mentally add up how much that one coffee was costing me. So $4 a time, 5 days a week, $20 a week, $80 a month, and almost $1,000 a year for one coffee in the morning. And, it's sort of that kind of looking at where your spending is going that can really start to add up over a decent amount of time. And that doesn't mean to say that you have to give up coffee entirely. I just gave up that one coffee, and after a year I bought myself a surfboard and a wetsuit. So that was my little thing. But there's often a lot of examples that we have that where we just kind of, this money just sort of seeps away from us. So start by, one thing people can do is sort of have a look at your bank statements over the last sort of 3 months. If you've got online banking, they're available on there. Go and just have a look at them and just see where your money is going, and just maybe have a think about some of those things. Another thing I'd suggest as well is really sort of once people have done that, have a look at some of those things on there that were linked to
some of your sort of behaviors. So were they impulse buys in the shops? Were they wants rather than needs? Were they just indulgences like me with my coffee? Or do you go out for brunch on a Saturday every day, every week, and spend sort of $50-$60 on a couple of brunches and a few coffees and things like that? And just start to really understand where you're spending your money. And then also have a think about the goals that you would want to achieve as well. Often people's financial goals are quite ill-defined and quite big. So buying a house, for example, or retirement. Buying a house is a huge, very expensive thing to do, and it's usually a long way in the future for a lot of people. And retirement is even more expensive and even further away in the future. So it's quite difficult to start to build out some steps to get towards those places. And often that is what stops people from actually getting started, not really having a plan of what they want to achieve, when, how, and all of those things. And start a conversation. There's nothing wrong with talking about it. You can talk about what's comfortable and leave aside what's not comfortable. If you're not comfortable sharing, your salary details, then don't. But, you could have a conversation with a partner or a friend about, hey, I'd really like to, go on a round the world trip one day, and talk about a little bit about the sort of how the finances for that might work. And just remember as well that money skills are skills, and like any other skill, you get better the more you do it, the more you practice it. So little and often is the way to go with really sort of starting to tackle your sort of your money behaviors and your finances. Just start small, do it little, do it regularly, and you'll soon find that you're building up some good habits and knowledge.
Thanks, Richard. There's some fabulous advice there. I think we might all be getting off the call and adding up how much we're spending on our daily coffees. You talked in your intro about growing up, not really, money not being something talked about, and also going through school, and it wasn't something that we learned about. If we wanted to kind of break that cycle in our own families, what could we do to get our children involved? Do you have any advice for people with young children now, what they could do to make that different in the future?
Yeah, just talk to them. Obviously it depends on what age your kids are, but you can start to introduce them to the idea of money, and they can start to understand things like opportunity cost. So yes, you can have those sweets, but that means that you can't have that new rugby ball next month or something like that. So you can start these concepts off with them really easily. There's a lot of apps these days that are designed to make and get kids involved in sort of financial literacy and learning about money. But what people have often found is that because the apps make it digital, there's no kind of pain that goes with it for children when they choose to spend this money that they've been saving or what have you. It's just transferring pixels on a screen or what have you. So a lot of people have sort of gone back to using physical money to help their children understand it, so that if they get some pocket money, they get a $5 note or whatever it is, and then if they want to spend that, they actually have to physically hand that note over at a shop to part with it. I mean, obviously lockdown dependent, of course, but then there's a sort of psychological worry there that that you're having to give something up rather than just move some pixels on the screen. So it can start to create some different sort of behaviors between physical and digital behaviors. If you're going to go the sort of the physical money route, what you could do is look up something like the 6-jar method or the 5-jar method. And basically this is the idea that you have sort of these 5 different jars or 6 different jars, depending on which one you want to do. And they have a different label each. So, one would be absolute necessities, probably not relevant for kids, but this would be things like everyday expenses like paying bills and whatnot. And then you would have an investment jar. So a little bit of that pocket money goes into the investment jar. A little bit goes into a jar for education. A little bit for long-term savings. So this might be for saving for something like, I don't know, a new bike or something like that. Another jar for giving. So this is spending on other people. So this might be charitable. donations, because it's always good to introduce kids to the concept of giving, but also might be for, when they need to buy a friend a birthday present or something like that, or a sibling. And then whatever, a little bit more into another jar for actual just general spending on, whatever it is they might want to spend on day to day. And these are sort of things that we can do as adults as well, as have these different buckets for, a bills bucket, a food bucket, investments bucket, and, a savings bucket and a charity bucket and those things. So it can be good. One thing that I did see years ago that I thought was an absolutely brilliant idea was a chap in the UK went into some UK schools, and he set the kids there the challenge, and he sort of gave them a little bit of money education around things like credit cards, bank accounts and things, and basically set them a challenge of saying, hey, do this with your parents, but get them to do a deal with you. And if you can save your parents any money, you get to keep 50% of whatever it is you save them. And all of these kids just went out like like crazy. They were just researching all the different financial products, and they'd go back home and say, hey mum, you're paying $180 for this credit card a year. If you choose this one, it's a better deal and you only pay 60, so you save 120, and under our deal I get 60 of that. So these kids were loving it. So there are lots of ways to get kids involved with it, and they love to learn along with us as well. But it does sometimes, as adults, it does mean that we sometimes have to get over our fear of not knowing, and learning along with them as well.
That's some great advice. Thank you, Richard. Because I know that's something that's come up for me. I have a 7-year-old, and he sees mum and dad pay for things by holding a plastic card over a machine at the shop or tapping a phone against a machine. So it is very, I think it is a challenge for us to work with our younger children and for them to understand this concept of money and paying for things and value. So you've given us some really great tips there. Thank you. Richard, just to finish us off, could you maybe explain to us a little bit about the different types of financial support available? Because I know we hear about budget advisors, and you mentioned financial advisors. You're a mentor. Maybe just a little bit about who we might go to for what type of support.
Yeah, and look, there's a lot, and it really depends on what kind of financial support you're sort of really looking for, and it would depend entirely on your own situation. So if you're struggling with debts, you would go to one place, versus if you're looking for investment advice, you might go and talk to a financial advisor. If you're wanting to do anything with your own sort of bank account area, and optimize some of that stuff, you would go and talk to your bank. Or if you want to find out if you're entitled to any benefits or something, there's places you would go for that. So there are a lot. A good place to start is always the Citizens Advice Bureau, though. They've got some really good information there. For anybody, and one of the really good things about the sort of financial support world is that it's often quite easy for people to point you towards somewhere else to get some more help from, or some different ways of thinking. So Citizens Advice is a good place to start. There's some really good online places. There's a website called Money Talks, which is really good. There's also the Sorted website, and Money Hub is another one, and they've all got some really good information on there, some really good guides, some really good articles, and some videos in some places, and some good explanations of some common financial concepts, and moving into investments, and how do you get started in things like that, and how do you budget, and all of those things. So there's some good places there. There's a government website as well, which I think is govt.nz, and then if you search for financial help for your family, you can have a look on there, which will sort of tell you about sort of benefits programs what you might be entitled to, particularly if you've got younger children. And obviously there's the Ministry of Social Development. They also have a benefits checker on their website. There's WINS. And so, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. And then you get into professional advice for things like financial advisors, mortgage brokers, and investment advisors, etc. And that's a whole nother level.
Thank you so much, Richard.